So what do you think? What do you think of the hat here, huh? Since we're talking about the War of 1812 in Canada today, I figured I'd wear some kind of Canadian-looking hat. Really looks like a Charlie Brown hat. Um, let's start off with a little bit of tech time. I know there were some problems with accessing, downloading, converting, whatever it is. I'm not 100% sure why. Some of you were able to get the Constitution worksheet as a Word document, so I've got some of them. But what I tried as well is to kind of go around it. I don't know much about Chromebooks beyond they're almost useless. But what I did was in lessons, that's the announcement I just sent out. And if you guys saw it, you should be able to at least get into Blackboard and see the announcements. But because of some of the confusion with and troubles with this, I slid the due date until midnight Thursday. Okay, so don't panic if it's not done. But also, maybe this will help. Under lessons, oops, timed out. Hey, if you get this, by the way, you click on something, you get this kind of red bar of death. Either just close and reopen, change browsers. What I found works the best is just go up here, click this GNTC home, and it takes you just back to the login page, and you just log back in, and it comes up. So while that's doing that, there we go. In the lessons, you go under the Constitution worksheet. Now there's two things. There's the Word document, and then, oh nice, I have two caps, but the PDF. So at least if you're able to open that, print it out, you could fill it out in pencil if you want, and then just turn it in Thursday or scan it, send it to me, take a picture of it. Just figure out, that's one of the things with college classes too. Like I'm sympathetic to problems with technology. But the other thing to try to do is work around or figure out a solution without being told, here's how you have to do it. Yeah, I know in high school you kind of get into that mentality of just do what you're told. Well, be a little more creative here. If you can figure out another way to get it and send it to me, do it. And again, that's why I put this, it's in the announcements, it's on the front page of the syllabus, but both my email addresses. And I had a few of you send the worksheet to both the school and personal. That's actually a good idea. That way it kind of ensures that I get it. So I generally will respond through the school email. So if I got your worksheet, I send it back through the GNTC email, hey, I got it. All right, and I'll grade these worksheets along with the midterm over this weekend. Right, so you'll be, again, kind of right up to date on how your grade's doing. While I'm talking about the midterm, don't forget it opens up, this being Wednesday the 3rd. It'll be available starting tomorrow, Thursday, and runs Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Right, 3 days again. A little longer than the quizzes, but you also have 2 hours to complete it, so that's usually plenty of time. Let me do one more piece of tech time before we jump into Chapter 8, kind of the dividing line chapter between the founding of the country and the movement toward disunion. It's this website, and I don't get any kickback for it. It's called Zamzar. And what it does is it converts all kinds of different files. And you can do, I forget, maybe 5 a day for free. And so I use this all the time. If I get something from somebody that's using a Mac, like a Pages file, I drop it in here and convert it to a document, right? A Word doc or a PDF. And so all you do to use this is you can just drag your file into this window. You pick what you want to convert it to. And if you look, man, this thing has all kinds of different documents, videos. I mean, it's really, really useful. And then hit convert and it'll spin it out and tell you, here it is, download it, your converted file. And so I find this pretty useful if you're struggling with a certain format and you want to change it to something else. Realize too, I just thought of this, so let me open it up real quick. You can do the same thing to a degree in Word. With the, I know this is small, file, save as. And let's just go to this folder. And underneath, whatever you want to call it, there are some different files available. So you can save a Word document as a PDF, something like that, a text file, etc. Right? Okay, enough of the tech time. Let's jump into Chapter 8, that kind of connecting chapter um, between revolution, actually between Constitution starting the country and the slow but steady march to disunion. And so you see the growing pains idea, this 30-year window. So it covers a lot of ground. I'm going to do it, I don't know, fairly quickly because we're covering everything in Chapter 8 in one sitting. And this is the last chapter that will be associated with the midterm. So everything Chapter 1 through 8 on the midterm is free game. But again, you've seen on my quizzes how I tend to focus on the big picture stuff. So really the same style, albeit it's not going to be a recycling of all the quiz questions. It would be useful to go through and review the quizzes. And I still need to post quiz 3 for you guys. So that's available for review. Okay, moving on. Just a kind of a midpoint check. How are we doing? Goods. Attendance has not been bad, especially with COVID. So keep that up. The more you're in class, the better the stuff sticks in your brain. And I know half of what we do is online, but still, don't give up on the videos either. I mentioned this to one of the cohorts. Video views are going down, and I can see a correlation between video views and quiz scores. So don't give up on the videos. Some are a little bit longer, but almost all of them are under an hour. One of the last ones was about 30 minutes. This one, I don't know, 45-ish seems about right. Participation in the classroom's decent. Still need more. There's still a few quiet folks. Speak up, and hopefully you're comfortable asking questions in our class. That I may disagree with you, but I'm not gonna flame you in public for it. All right. And I'd say overall, quiz-wise, you guys are doing about average, which is fine. Remember, this is a sophomore level college class. So again, I do try to focus on the big picture, but they are it's more conceptual as opposed to 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, blah, blah, blah. The bads, from what I'm seeing, is, look, this is beyond the technology piece, but keep checking your email. Um, and again, if you're having trouble through the GNTC email website, you can just Google Outlook, and there's a way to get to Outlook and sign in using your school username password that doesn't use that link. And you know what? Let's do one more tech time. And this is what Kinsey was talking about yesterday in class, but it seemed like you guys were kind of half paying attention. Let's see. I got too much stuff open. So for whatever reason, this link can be troublesome for some reason. So if you just Google Outlook, it gives you an alternate pathway to enter the email system using your same username password, right? Your school email address and your GNTC birthday style. One other thing to note, and I need to mention this to the other class as well. I mentioned this, but there is a way through this through the school website to get those 5 free downloads of Microsoft Office. And the way to find it, it's bloody impossible. So you just type it in the search, free Office or Microsoft Office, and it'll show you the website where it links you to it. You can download it on home laptops, tablets, computers, etc. All right, so I lied. More tech time. The other thing that starts fading away is even looking at the textbook. So remember, I mean, the textbook is free game. I'm not going to go in there and find some minute detail just to trip you guys up. But that's the basis of what we talk about in class. So the classroom is above and beyond. Yes, it refers to and uses some of the words of the day type, those key glossary terms, but the textbook's still there and still part of the course. All right, so chapter 8, we're going to cover all 4 of these instead of splitting them in half. And then looking ahead, if you look, every chapter from here on out is going to be split at least in 2 and sometimes in 3 to really decompress and allow a discussion of things like the lead up to the Civil War. A couple quotes for you. This comes from Thomas Jefferson a little bit later in his life. Right, he was a fairly young man during the Revolution and the constitutional process. So he's one of the last of the founding fathers, and he sees this question of the Missouri question. It has to do with slavery and the Missouri Compromise that is out there kind of looming at this point. And he calls it holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't dare let go. And so he sees this split in slavery versus free states as a potential problem in the future, and he's absolutely right. And this comes from a guy, Alexis de Tocqueville. He's a French, kind of a student of America. He comes to America and sees what's going on. He can see visually the difference between the free and slave states and the economies of and the vibrance of. But this is one of his quotes as well, which I kind of like, that we'll endure until Congress figures out it can bribe us with our own money. Right? Talking about taxes. So some words of the day. These, I put them up just because they can get confusing. We're going to talk about political parties. We're actually going to look at kind of a timeline of political parties. Today we know we got Democrats and Republicans, but it hasn't always been that way. It's been that way since the Civil War, so a huge chunk of our country's existence, but not always the same. This is different. This is not the Federalist Party of Washington, sort of, Adams, early political party. It's the idea of separation of power. And we talked about that when we were discussing the Constitution, the idea that there's federal level power, but it also goes down to the state, the local, the people, right? The last 2 amendments in the Bill of Rights reflect that if it's not covered in the Constitution, it's delegated to the states, to the people. So that's what federalism is, so that we don't have all the power at the federal government. It's divided up. And the smart idea behind that is people closer to the constituents. The local mayors and governors know more about what the city or state needs than some bureaucrat in Washington. But there are some federal level issues like a Department of Defense. We don't want 50 states having to raise their own little armies and then try to put them together if we need them. Oof. A lot of isms, right? There we go. Ferris Bueller. Isms are bad. Republicanism. This is not the Republican Party. In fact, it doesn't even exist yet. But it's the idea of people, we the people. Remember the word sovereign, where power lies. So republicanism says people hold the power, not a monarch, not a king, not even the president. Powerful, yes, but not all powerful. And this idea of a cabinet we've talked about a couple times, right? President Biden right now is in the process of filling his out. He's gotten quite a few selected and approved by the Congress. But there's nowhere in the Constitution that says thou shalt have a cabinet. It was more of a decision by Washington that he couldn't do everything, nor did he want to. So he brought in people of wisdom to cover different areas. And his cabinet was really 4 people, sometimes 5. You see it. The Postmaster General wasn't actually a cabinet position. But we'll see who these guys are. And in fact, Washington picked people he didn't necessarily agree with, which is wise. You don't want a bunch of yes men around you, right? Which was unwise by some former presidents. Secretaries, Secretary of State, Secretary of Interior. The one that's not called a secretary but is part of the cabinet is the Attorney General, right? And then this idea, the Constitution neither provides for a cabinet nor a 2-party system. The 2-party political system kind of evolves organically as a alternative, we can say, from the Federalist Party. We see the rise of the Democratic Republicans, and that's Jefferson's party, right? He's kind of the lead on that one, and they eventually go away. So we see that evolution. We're going to actually look through a chart of that. A couple other ones. This idea, the Non-Intercourse Act, snicker, right? He. Really what it had to do with, it was a series of laws regulating commerce between America and the natives. And it was really to put pressure on and continue to squeeze the natives. And we're going to see the natives suffer mightily in the War of 1812. Again, it goes back to kind of that style of how we interact, that the French were played nicer with the natives, whereas the English and then now the Americans tend to be, we're going to force the issue, whatever it is. We want the buffalo, we're going to take them. We want the land, we're going to take it. And this kind of falls into that as well. And you're going to see that as part of the War of 1812 as well. That's why I mentioned it. As is this idea of impressment. It doesn't mean, ooh, I'm impressed. It means you see somebody and make them work for you. And this happened, the impressment of American sailors. British ships were seizing American ships, capturing the crew of that ship, and then forcing to work for the British military. So that doesn't go over very well because now, hey man, we're a free country. We're Americans. We're not Brits. But yeah, be that as it may. All right, back to the Constitution. Um, if you recall, we discussed there's three big compromises that have to occur to get 9 of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution. Federalist, anti-federalist, big and small government. And the compromise there was the addition of the Bill of Rights, which helped the anti-federalists say, okay, we'll sign on. Um, Slavery was one of them. And then the great compromise, as it was known, was the idea of big state, small state representation. And to solve that, we got the Senate. All states get 2 senators. The House, states get representation based on population size. Okay, so I focus on that third one, the idea of slavery. We have the Fugitive Slave Law and the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is to the southern states, and then the prohibition of the slave trade 20 years after the Constitution is signed, so 1807. So what it did is it kicked the can down the road. And there was a hope that slavery, maybe this compromise would last, or even perhaps that slavery in and of itself would eventually go away. Because we'd seen that happen in the North and Middle states where slavery slowly died away, but it becomes more important for the Southern economy. And there's something that happens. It's in this time frame, we're not going to talk about it just yet, that really elevates the need for slavery to a level the founders could never have imagined. Hoped it would last, it did not. And so that was one of, depending on which cohort, um, both are going to cover this Missouri Compromise. So this is the first post-constitutional attempt to settle the issue of slavery. It works for 30 years and then it falls apart. The big deal with the Three-Fifths Clause was it artificially inflated the power of the South in Congress because it counted 3/5 of each slave toward their overall population. So it tipped the scales more toward, if the South didn't have the Three-Fifths Clause, they would have had much less representation, especially in the House, but uh, in Congress in general. Right? Each state gets 2 senators, so the balance of power there. But in the House, based on population, so now we kind of artificially add a big chunk of slave population to their total count, which boosts the number of representatives they get. So that's why it tips that balance of power. And here's your federalism just one more time. We talked about checks and balances between different branches of government. There's checks and balances between the states, what they can and can't do. Sometimes the federal government turns a blind eye, like it did for a while on selling of marijuana in Colorado, right? It was still against the law federally, but nobody went in there and raided all of the weed stores and shut them down. And now that, in fact, has changed. But again, early on, there's a couple things. This idea of the articles made it very, very tiny U, very big S, like all S, that the power was at the state level. But even still, as we get to the Constitution, states have a lot of power. And that's how the founders wanted it. Now, states' rights or states' power has shrunk a bit over time. Um, but the other piece to this, and it doesn't get talked about much, is there was an idea that floated through the Constitutional Convention that this was all somewhat voluntary, that we made these compromises to get 9 of the 13 states to sign, and in fact 11 of the 13 did, and then finally all of them. But there was also this idea that, if we don't really like this arrangement, that we can leave or amend it. Now that's going to be put to the test in the Civil War, because Lincoln doesn't believe that you could just leave the Union like that. And they're brought back in by force. And that's kind of been the way since, right? That look, every state, if you look it up, every state has a website that's gathering signatures to secede from the Union, even today. But none of them have near enough power to do that. And it would be not in their best self-interest. And we'll probably talk about that eventually. So we've got a country, we've got a constitution, we've got a set of laws of the land, we've got the thesis statement for America in the preamble to the Constitution, and so now we have a chief executive, right, the head of the executive branch. So Washington, I put elected in italics because he was really picked, and he was the natural choice, having led the Continental Army through the Revolutionary War, being a man of honor and dignity. And he takes this first oath of office in New York City. Washington, D.C. is not the capital yet. He believes in that idea of republicanism, that yes, we participate, we the people, but we also have representatives to represent us in today what would be Washington. Okay, he has a sense of duty. I mean, Washington, he is very aware that anything he does as the first president is going to set the future precedents, that people will follow what he does. So he's thoughtful about what he does. So here's just a few. There's more than this. But that idea, the Republican idea, republicanism as in representative government, not the party. Republicans don't exist at this point. Mr. President, instead of Your Highness, Your Honor, Your Excellency, any kind of royal or monarchical titles. He does win respect. He starts to develop diplomatic relations with nations outside the U.S., and he steps down after a second term, which sets that precedent that nobody until FDR serves more than 2 terms. Teddy Roosevelt tried, but it didn't work. And so that eventually gets quantified in the 22nd Amendment. So you read about it, Washington, he wasn't really hesitant. He saw it as a natural duty. He was very duty oriented to be the president for 1 term, but he was all about stepping down after that first term. He'd had enough. I mean, he'd been fighting first with the British, then with the Continental Army, now president. He wanted a little R&R time, and he had to be begged basically to serve a second term. Right? He did a couple other things that were pretty amazing as well. He resigned his military commission after the war was over, so that he didn't have this dual title of like chief of the army and president. The guy was smart, and he understood that balance between military and civilian leadership. Some of his early picks to work with him, he tried to pick people both geographically different, new areas of the country. And remember, we're getting that new Western Reserve territory, the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that area. And he really looks for people that know what they're doing as opposed to those that agree with him. So his cabinet is not a bunch of yes men. In fact, him and Jefferson don't get along at all. Maybe that's overstated, but they don't get along well. So the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, he disagrees with Washington. But that's good. We don't want yes men. Attorney General, right, the top cop as we call it now. Secretary of War, which would today be called the Secretary of Defense. And we saw Henry Knox dragging artillery out of Fort Ticonderoga during the Revolution. And then Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, who was big on strong monetary policy and a central unified kind of bank of the United States. So we don't have state-to-state issues with money, right? Oh, Massachusetts money's worth more than South Carolina money. And that fifth one I mentioned, not technically part of the cabinet, but the Postmaster General, because communications at this point are through written correspondence, right? So the idea of a post office in the country, but also think about movement of letters, of official correspondence between countries, and how long that takes, because it's on a boat coming from England to the United States. And that slow process, that long timeline, leads to problems when things are happening fast, as in the War of 1812. There's some correspondence moving across the ocean that doesn't get there in time, and so wars can expand even though there's an attempt coming across the ocean in a boat to stop it. We're spoiled today that we have instantaneous communications. Believe it or not, even up and through the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, that's why they got the red hotline phone between Moscow and Washington, so that things didn't get out of control. There you go. Picture of George taking the oath of office. There's been some consternation about what you swear on. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the Bible. It's really the choice of the appointee or the victor, the elected official, as to what they want to use. Most people choose the Bible because it shows fidelity and faith, but you could do it on whatever, right? 1984 by George Orwell. Democracy versus a republic. We tend to get these confused. We think of America as a democracy, and we are to an extent, but we're really a democratic republic. And that means, yes, we vote, and whoever gets the most votes wins the mayor or the governorship. But you guys know that for the presidential race, it's not strictly popular vote. In fact, that isn't really relevant. It's the electoral vote. So we elect people to represent us in Washington. Now, what you could argue today is we could pull back a little bit from the democratic republic idea and be more of a true democracy with technology. If we made voting online secure and easy, we, the people, could be more engaged in individual votes as opposed to Congressman Looney Tunes from North Georgia. But we'll see. There's a lot of resistance to online voting. Some of it's irrational, if you ask me. But we do. People still rule. We, the people, is still there. Sometimes directly, indirectly through our representatives. Why? Because, I mean, most of us are busy. And so their job, theoretically, is to stay attuned to what's going on in their home state, in their area, in the world, in Washington, and make the best choice. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they make the choice based on who gives them money to run. But I don't want to go down that road just yet. Majority rule limited to protect minority rights. That idea of pluralism. Yes, majority rule, but we don't just trample minority rights. And again, this is minority in the sense of whatever the cause is, not ethnic minority, but minority, the lesser of the voting blocks, right, that lost, whatever it was. Yeah, believe it or not, we know about the presidential elections, but for a while, senators were also done in this fashion. They were basically picked by the good old boy network in the state to represent them. And that changes when we get to the populist and progressive parties approaching the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s. So that's beyond this class. But you know today that we actually vote for, you better know, in Georgia, right? We just had those two special elections that were uber annoying with the commercials, but yet we vote for senators now. And judges appointed, not elected, because we don't want judges, at least at the federal level, running for office, because that can pollute their objectivity. Let's just say that. Oops. Electoral college, let's just talk about it vis-a-vis the map. So I went back just to 2016 this time, but you can pull it up for any one of them. And you can see how if you win a state, even by one vote, theoretically, in the electoral college, and you saw how close Georgia was, you win all of those electoral votes. And there's only two exceptions. One is Nebraska, which all went for President Trump in 2016. But you notice Maine is the other one, and it's kind of crosshatched. That's because these two states report electoral votes by congressional district as opposed to a whole statewide piece. Is it better? Is it worse? You can see most of the rest of the states, or all the rest of the states, just do it in a lump. So if you win Georgia by 10,000 votes, you get all Georgia's electoral votes. And you can see the outcome, and it's interesting, isn't it, that we flipped 2020 and the vote count was the same, albeit Biden 306, Trump 232. So not a landslide by either of them, regardless of what was said, but a solid victory nonetheless. And I think I showed this map. I'm not sure. I've shown it in a couple classes, but this breaks it down. Right, this is by state, but when you break it down by county, it becomes a little more clear. And you can see if you look at the pockets of blue, blue is a coastal phenomenon, blue being Democrat. Blue is a cotton belt phenomenon. The residual pieces of the old cotton belt are here, blue, and it's a big city phenomenon. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Nashville, Atlanta, and the Metroplex, right? So you see the more rural areas, much more red. And the strength of the color is how predominant that was. So this county, I think that's Bismarck, South Dakota. Look how dark blue that is. That means that was almost everybody voted Democrat. And the same thing could be said, for some of these in Texas, deep, deep red. Very strong, almost all Republican vote. Okay. I like this map just because it shows the quantity. That's what the bars represent. And so you can see with this how you might, and in fact it's happened a few times, win so-called the popular vote but lose the electoral college. Because if I win a bunch of states by a very tight margin and lose one like California by a huge margin, that can tip the popular vote away from the electoral vote. So squeaking by in a few, look, if I win by 6 million votes in California, that's probably going to overcome these smaller, closer races in some of the more rural areas because there's just not that many people. But the idea behind, look, I get the argument, get rid of the electoral college, just go popular vote. But then that eliminates the need to campaign or even consider some of these smaller, more rural areas, because if I'm running it's just popular vote, where am I going to go? I'm going to all these big cities because that's where the popular vote lies. So there's pros and cons to each. Okay, trying to connect a little bit of the past to the present. One of the things that was not in the original Constitution but comes about shortly thereafter is this idea of, is this constitutional? The idea of judicial review. And so the court, Supreme Court especially, can look at a new law or a new decision and say, yes, that's in line with the Constitution, or no, it's not. And there's different views on this, and without getting too technical, some people are very strict as written of the Constitution, and some are more about what did it intend. And that takes a little more mental exercise, because do we know, or can we just suppose what the founders intended? But that happens in 1803. This is a famous Supreme Court case that allows for judicial review, right? Declared something unconstitutional. That wasn't in the original Constitution, but now that's kind of the way, the law of the land, if you will. That's how we do things, right? So that kind of completes the balance of power between the three branches of government, the checks and balances idea. Okay, so now we're in a new country. We got to deal with other issues, troubles abroad. Oh, look at that. Imagine that, France and England back at war constantly, right? Who do we side with? Just won a big victory over the British, had the help of the French to do that. But Washington, and he says this again in his farewell address, is he wants to avoid foreign entanglements, because now that can get you in trouble. If you side with the French, now the English are mad, and vice versa. So he says the U.S. is staying out of this. We're going to stay neutral. Right? Probably pretty smart. He says, in fact, if you support any of these as a civilian, you can be in trouble as well. Jefferson, you can see, is the Secretary of State, and he supports the French and the French Revolution. He also had some ideas about the Constitution being basically rewritten every 30 years or so. He was an outside-the-box thinker, we could say that. But you can see, even within Washington's cabinet, within his administration, there's differences of opinion. and we kind of stay out of it, which is usually the best. As Washington does his second term, we're going to see Adams run. He only wins one term as a Federalist. It was really the initial only party, but we see the growth of this Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Party, and you can see the two types and why they might form up. Federalist, more national, more federal um, strength of federal government, makes sense with what their name is. They're not the anti-federalists. Conservative, business oriented. What does that sound like? It sounds like the Republicans of today, whereas the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, more agrarian, more ideological, typically anti-federalist, weaker central, stronger state governments, and that sounds at least a little bit like the Democrats of today. So that split develops, and there's a natural tension. And there's really only two times in the country's history where we didn't have a sound, robust two-party system. Both times things didn't go very well. One was an attempt at secession, and one was the Civil War. Right. I know this is not the clearest. You can see where I got it from history shots. But to try to just talk through this a little bit, up at the top, you see the president. Underneath, it's almost, you can't read it, but the timeline, and then the parties involved. And so you can see this Federalist Party survives for a while, even after Jefferson wins, but it slowly fragments, and we see the pieces coagulate into what becomes the Whig Party. And then these start to fracture under the weight of pro and anti-slavery sentiments and the rise of the Republican Party. Right? And Lincoln's the first elected president from that party, but he's not the first to run. The Republicans ran a candidate in 1856. And then since then, the common theme has been Republicans and Democrats. Those are the two most powerful. They have the most money and the most clout, but they're not the only parties out there. So this, again, just kind of illustrates that. We see the slow rise of the Democratic Republicans, and the first president to win that is Jefferson. And look, you see them kind of serve for a while as the Federalists fade into oblivion. This coalescing of a single party, that lasts only for a short time, and then we see it splinter, right? And it'll splinter under the weight of Andrew Jackson versus Quincy Adams. So that's where the next chart kicks in. And this one, you can see the timeline a little more clearly. So we pick it up there. Here's Andrew Jackson, and you can see that's the Democratic Party. And that line's pretty consistent, albeit it'll split as we lead up to Civil War. But the move toward what becomes known as the Republican Party is a collection of other pieces, parts, as parties rise and fall. So you see this kind of national Republican, so that name's out there at least, but different pieces, parts. This Know-Nothing Party, the American Party, the Free Soil Party, Liberty Party. They're around for a while, and all those start to slowly coalesce into, guess what the red line is? The Republicans that we know of today. And there's that first guy, John C. Fremont, that ran in 1856. He loses, but that's the first attempt of putting some of these pieces together to make a Republican, a more national level party, as opposed to a piecemeal one. The Whig Party starts to split, take a guess, Free Soil, under the weight of pro and anti-slavery sentiments. So the Whigs aren't around that long, but they do have a couple election wins. And Abraham Lincoln actually started out as a Whig and becomes a Republican, as you can see the line kind of merge. And so that's, I think, the last one. It's fairly short. This looks like a mess of a train wreck, but this illustrates the stress and strain of pro and anti-slavery in politics. And so these guys kind of coalesce into a political powerhouse, the Republicans, whereas the Democrats split over the issue of slavery, Southern and Northern. Wonder who's who. So what happens when you split your party up like that is you're going to lose because you're diluting the votes. And that may happen if we see former President Trump try to come up. He's talked about this Patriot Party. Well, if that happens, he's going to siphon off Republicans primarily. that may split the Republican vote and ensure Democratic victories for the next couple cycles. Right? So that's something to be careful of. We saw that with Teddy Roosevelt as well, the splitting up of a party. So a little walk down memory lane. Out in the Northwest, this new territory we've gained, that tests the new government, and it's called the Whiskey Rebellion because out in the hinterlands, one, it's easier to move barrels of whiskey than just bulk grain, and Americans have a penchant for drinking, so that's out there. It's a cash crop. We want money for the federal government. What's Hamilton? He's a super duper federalist, strong central government. So more taxes mean as I can do more. And so he wants to put a tax on whiskey. Sound familiar? Sounds like the British with the Sugar Act. We could call this the Whiskey Act, perhaps. And guess what? These folks out in the hinterlands don't like it. So they revolt, right? The Whiskey Rebellion. But here it illustrates the power of the central government. Whereas if this had been under the Articles of Confederation, remember Shays' Rebellion, they barely were able to put that down. Now with a more powerful centralized federal government, it's easier to crush this rebellion. Good or bad, I guess it depends on your point of view and your idea on whiskey. Right, so again, moving forward, Washington steps down, sets that precedent. He's done 2 terms. That's enough. Somebody else's chance. So the Federalist Adams runs, wins, but then after that, we see the Federalist Party start to fade. Right? Democratic Republicans run Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and we start to see some friction even within this party, and there's a total flub in 1800 by these guys, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Originally, the Constitution, today what we see is you run as a ticket, right? It was Trump-Pence versus Biden-Harris. So you get the package deal. You're voting for the 2 of them together. But early on, it was whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the second was VP, which is an interesting dynamic with a 2-party system. Think about that. If that was the same in 2016, we would have had President Trump, Vice President Clinton, or vice versa. That would have been an interesting dynamic, huh? Okay, and so the Democratic Republicans have this plan. Here's what we're going to do. So Adams wins in 1796, but we're talking about this election in 1800. He's going to run again, but he's going to fail. And so the Democratic Republicans are like, we got an idea. We're going to get both these guys in office. None of this, we don't want Adams as vice president. So they say, okay, you electors, you vote, everybody vote for Jefferson, and all but one vote for Burr. So that's kind of good. Jefferson president, Burr vice president, right? We're making this work. We're scheming. Well, guess what? They fail, right? Oops, each elector voted for both. So it's a tie. So it goes to the House of Representatives to break the tie. But they're the ones that were kind of cooking this up in the first place, some of them. And so what you have is these deadlock votes. So after 35 attempts, everything comes out tie. The balance is tipped, and it's Alexander Hamilton who really kind of tips the balance because he didn't like Jefferson, right? Hamilton was more like Washington, more like Adams, more central federalist in nature. So he didn't like Jefferson's anti-federalist ideas, but he hated Aaron Burr. So he ends up siding with Jefferson. So that's how he wins the election of 1800. So after that, Congress goes, ugh, we can't have this happen again. So the 12th Amendment's put in place to preclude nonsense like that. All right, talking about Jefferson, the sage of Monticello. Smart guy, he's been around, right? Primary author of the Declaration. Conciliatory with the Federalists. So he's not, we won, Democratic, Republicans, you guys can beat it. So he tries to make nice. He keeps some of their policies. He keeps that Bank of the United States, that Hamiltonian idea. So he builds bridges, right? He's kind of across the aisle, what we would say today. Now, some departures from what the Federalists did, paying the national debt. What a concept. We've been talking about that. He saw what it did to the king in the lead up to the Revolution. We can see what it may do now, having so much debt. He, again, wasn't, all highfalutin, more of a common man approach. And he moves now to Washington, D.C., where the capital is. Under Jefferson, We get an offer you can't refuse. So Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, he gains that territory that was out past the Mississippi River from Spain. So now that's French territory. And he wants to use it, put troops in there, and help him supply, especially naval warfare in the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, so with that, it's like, wow, French taking over that half just beyond the Mississippi. It may be that we'll go to war with France, and what would that make us allied with Britain? Yikes! But Napoleon loses some of this kind of New World territory, this West Indies area out in the Caribbean. And so now he's worried that, uh-oh, the Brits are going to get that territory. So instead of that happening, he says, hey, I'll sell it to you, you America. And yeah, I mean, Napoleon could always use more money. He can spend more money on warfare. The Blue Star video is a clip from Master and Commander. It shows some of the naval warfare of the Napoleonic Wars. So he sells Louisiana to the U.S. We know that, right? The Louisiana Purchase. But the scale of this is impressive. Look at that, 15 million for that many square miles. It comes out to 3 cents an acre. Whew, what a deal. Now the Constitution doesn't really allow for this. So Jefferson does not get congressional approval. Remember, Congress controls the purse. They're the budgetary element. But he abandons that because he's looking at it like, I can't pass this up. And probably rightly so. That he says, I'm just going to go buy it. And look at what it does to the country. I mean, it effectively doubles the size. Okay? And now we're going to see some refinements of the northern borders over time. That's another huge chunk. So now instead of the Mississippi being the border, now it's out to the Rocky Mountains. Wow. This is the beginnings of what we'll know as manifest destiny, that it's the destiny of America to go from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, to own all of this. And guess what? The last piece of this War of 1812 was there was an attempt to actually gain Canada as well. Explorations of the new territory, right? Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, they go all the way out to the West Coast and come back and survive. Sort of miraculous. There was another one, not as well known, but if you've ever heard of Pike's Peak, it's named after Zebulon Pike, who again exits from St. Louis, hence the gateway, right? The gateway to the west. And he goes out through the Colorado territory down through Mexico and comes back. So two big explorations out into the south central and western parts of the country. Okay. Yeah, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about this, the Burr and Hamilton duel. Remember, Burr's got a grudge against Hamilton just from the election of 1800. He's shunned by Jefferson. He seemed like kind of an angry guy, right? And the selection process reinforced that rivalry. And so he's cooking up a scheme on his own side with the Federalists. He's going to pull New York and New England states out of the Union. Remember, there was that idea that this was voluntary. So he's going to run for the governorship of New York to start facilitating secession from the Union. But he loses, and part of it's because Hamilton's campaigning against him. Right? Not running against him, but campaigning. And so this leads to the famous duel, right? And the idea that Hamilton purposely missed, I think that's bogus if you read about it. It's his shot, he fires high, but it hit a branch right above Burr, so I think he was aiming at him. And of course, Burr connects with his shot, flees, is arrested, but eventually acquitted. And I think it's still in the museum in Washington, the bullet from the duel, right? All right, and a little bit external-wise, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the War of 1812 because it's bloody confusing and not super relevant. But some of the other things Jefferson has to deal with, the Barbary pirates, these pirates in the Mediterranean are capturing American ships, capturing American sailors, and we'll stop doing it if you pay us. But we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? That's been the American motto since then. But Jefferson finally does pay to free these American sailors. So there's some fighting back and forth, but eventually we do pay to get our sailors free. Okay? And then again, war between Britain and France, kind of ongoing, right? We're staying out of it, but as far as shipping goes, we can make some money shipping stuff to both sides. We do that again in the future too. And the Brits and French start just seizing U.S. merchant ships on the high seas. start impressing, forcing these sailors to work for them. Okay? This just to show you the Barbary Coast is this North African coast along the Mediterranean. And so you can understand why there's a lot of ship merchant travel in and around this area. So that's what Jefferson's having to deal with. So here we are leading into the last piece, this War of 1812, impressing American sailors, right? The Brits have a huge fleet, they could use the manpower, so they're attacking American ships. Naval, not merchant. Some merchant, yes, but that's an act of war, isn't it? Attacking American ships? And there's some in the country saying we need to go to war. But are we in a position to do that? We still don't have a fleet near what the British do. So there's some wise choices made as to we'll use politics, we'll use the economic arm of power to not go to war. But 1812 is right around the corner. To kind of force this, Jefferson says, you know what, we're going to embargo our own stuff. We're going to stop shipping things to the Brits until they stop stealing our sailors. Really, that hurts American merchants more than anything else. And guess what? We see that again in the lead up to the Civil War. Okay? U.S. trade suffers more than Britain. The South tried to embargo itself with cotton to bring the British in on the side of the Confederacy. It didn't work. All right, the Blue Star under my head is probably a way better explanation by John Green, Crash Course U.S. History, but it is confusing. So I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, and don't feel bad if you're like, what's going on? I don't think a lot of people understand what was going on. But impressment of American sailors was a piece of it. We have Madison now as president, right? The father of the Constitution, if you will. So you see kind of three things go into this. Trade restrictions, because the Brits are at war with France, so they don't want us trading with them. Of course they're at war. Impressment of U.S. sailors, we've mentioned that, right? And the Brits, not really covertly, sort of, under that Non-Intercourse Act, are trying to support the Indians, the natives, against this new American government, because we're still in our infancy at this point. So those three things are building up and pushing us toward potential war. Now, this one, confused. We're gonna open up trade to both sides. We're gonna trade with both sides, but only if they stop messing with U.S. shipping. And this idea, whoever acted first would be in favor with the U.S. What? How the heck? How do you know somebody's not doing something until they haven't done it for a long time? So this is very confusing to everybody, including me. Napoleon, right? He sold us the Louisiana territories. He leaves U.S. shipping alone first, I guess, right? So we become more allied economically with France. And look, if he can make Britain fight him and the U.S. at the same time, it makes victory for him easier. So we declare war on Britain. Interesting, right? And America's divided over this. Kind of like we were at the Revolution, but much more significantly. Mercantile states, those that are producing goods, oppose the war. Why? Because it hurts business. The agrarian states, the more farming states, the more slave-oriented states, support the war. Why? Because as part of this mess, this mix, is the idea of we can take Canada, because Canada is what? It's British. So that opens up more territory for potential slave, oh, nice typo, territoire, more power, more opportunity for slave states to have more power, right? So all of that is in the mix. Add to that the poor natives, right? What they just keep getting hammered from both sides. So we have these two groups, and Tecumseh's fairly famous. He was known as the Prophet. He tries to align these different tribes together and to fight against America. And of course, the British would love this, right? But they're defeated as usual, right? The Indians always get hammered. And notice, this is kind of in the lead up to the War of 1812. Fought mostly at sea. You can read this. I'll show it to you on a map. That works better. And then it ends basically exactly where it started. There's no change. U.S.-British relations go back to what's pre-war. So all of this fighting, all of this craziness for nothing. Really, the biggest thing that happens is more destruction of the natives. And oh, by the way, the war's over officially, but Andrew Jackson storms into New Orleans and defeats the British even after the peace treaty has been signed. So he becomes a national hero, and we're going to see him on the presidential stage very soon. So not the greatest map, but you can see this is a British picket line, right, a blockade. And we have battles in and around the Washington, D.C. area, right, the burning of the Capitol, the insurrection, right, that hadn't happened until January 6th, since 1812, and then in and around the Great Lakes. So you can see that Canadian piece that, this is British if we win. But what ends up happening is basically we just go back to pre-war. So Canada remains that British piece. And then down here at the very end, Jackson going into New Orleans after the war's over. Way to go, Andrew. If you go to the museum in Washington, the American History Museum, this is Old Glory, the flag that was flying over Fort McHenry that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner about. And it was in the War of 1812 that he wrote it. It's pretty neat to see the actual flag. Right? There's Jimi Hendrix playing the Star-Spangled Banner. All right, almost done. Hang in there. Jeez, about an hour. After the War of 1812, really after the Battle of New Orleans, so the war is officially over now, I guess, we start to see the rise of American nationalism, of national spirit. We see ourselves as the new kind of chosen people. And another typo. I was fat fingering this morning. We saw the same thing happen after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The British feeling like, man, we are the chosen people. That's not bad unless it goes too far, and it can as we deal with the natives out in the Great Plains. The patriotic culture developing, 4th of July, celebrating the Declaration of Independence, American songs, art, things like that, poetry. And people start writing about the Founding Fathers because they're fading out of the scene now. They're dying away, and we're into really a second generation. And so people like Abraham Lincoln are going to grow up in this time frame. That's why he feels very connected still to the Founding Fathers. And we start to speak more American than English. And so this is the last slide. By the end of this period, as we get to 1820, where we're going to start looking at this Missouri Compromise, we start to see the country dividing. And it's really dividing into kind of three parts. More the industrial, financial section, right? We saw that with the Triangle Trade Route way back. The more agrarian Great Plains section, foodstuffs, corn, the Corn Belt, and the more southern plantation, still kind of enumerated articles section, tobacco and cotton. So this split, this trifurcation, if that's a word, is going to morph into a bifurcation, northern and southern, over the issue of slavery. So that's kind of a prelude to what's happening next. Right, just under an hour, a little long, but the last chapter, the last piece to fill out your brain with everything that's going to be on the midterm. Right, and so this will be who cohort A gets this video. Cohort B will talk about this in class. And the test will be available starting tomorrow, Thursday, February 4th. Good luck. Take your time on it. You should have plenty of time. But do budget it. Don't waste time. If there's a question you don't know, skip over it, come back. Okay? And good luck.